Heavy delay starting at the incline. Bustled in Sherman Oaks on the 405 southbound for Valley Vista. That's sinking into the Carver lane, causing heavy delays from Sherman Way. And you got a crash in East LA. Two left lanes taken up on the 60 westbound at Indiana Street. The 60 jams up at Atlantic Boulevard. Crash in Irwindale, taking up two left lanes on the 210 westbound at the 605. That's got you sold from Grand Avenue.
Jackson Hewitt gets you your biggest tax refund guaranteed, plus a chance to double your refund or win weekly prizes with their Double Your Refund sweepstakes. File your taxes on the double. No purchase necessary. U.S. residents 18 or older who file a 2022 federal tax return. Ends 4/2/23.
This is the KBLA Sports Minute with Ray Richardson.
Both of LA's NBA teams are back in action tonight in the Midwest. The Clippers are at Milwaukee. The Lakers are at Indiana. LeBron enters tonight's game 89 points shy of passing Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. As LeBron gets closer to the record, ticket prices for the Lakers' next two home games are rising. The lowest ticket price for the February 7th game against Oklahoma City is $326, a 390% increase. For the February 9th game against Milwaukee, the lowest ticket is $357. Top 5 men's college basketball teams in this week's AP poll: Purdue, Tennessee, Houston, Alabama, and Arizona. Top 5 women's teams: South Carolina, Stanford, LSU, Indiana, and UConn. No debates, no speculation, just the info you need. That's your KBLA Sports Minute. I'm Ray Richardson. Stay with us for more news, opinions, and conversation on KBLA Talk 1580. We've got a lot to talk about.
You ready?
Excuse me. Now that I have your attention, may I ask you this question? Why do you believe police brutality continues to exist in this country? Do you believe it to be a systemic problem, or should we judge police misconduct on a case-by-case basis? And what's your opinion on the best course of action to solve the problem? Well, you have come to the right place. You're listening to LA's all-new progressive talk radio station. Of the people, by the people, for the people.
Hey, I sure appreciate that.
It's KBLA Talk 1580. We got you covered round the clock. Racism, we got you. Progressive politics, we got you. Health and wellness education, we have you covered.
We're going to have to put it back in the hands of the people.
A black-owned and operated, evidence-based alternative radio station for progressive, open-minded people like you and me.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Welcome home, LA. We're all in this together.
Let's get it on.
It's KBLA Talk 1580, broadcasting from the heart of LA's Leimert Park. We've got a lot to talk about.
We are going to have to fight. We're going to have to struggle. We're going to have to struggle relentlessly to bring
Hi, Tavis. Good to hear your voice.
It's good to hear your voice. Delighted to have you back on. Let me jump right in and make the most of this hour. Don't want to waste a single minute with you. Let me just start with some basics, some fundamentals, and we'll build as we move through this hour. As I said a moment ago, America's gone crazy. Thank you, Prince. We've gone crazy, but we're going crazy in ways that just seem unimaginable. I'm wondering, for starters, again, as we build this foundation, what examples you would offer, and I want to just get out of your way and give you time. What examples would you offer of the fact that we are becoming more fascist every day? And number two, what do you think the root cause of that is? Take it away.
Well, I think we're becoming more fascist every day because we're starting to see policies in a political party and a language that basically begins with the language of brutality. And it increasingly becomes normalized. It's the language of hatred. It's the language of racism. It's the language of violence. There's cause for civil war. And we're beginning to see a party that is unapologetic about not only its hatred of democracy, but its willingness to align itself with a whole range of fascist demagogues, whether we're talking about Orban in Hungary or formerly with Bolsonaro in Brazil, that is more than willing to say democracy doesn't work anymore, and that basically what we're going to do is implement policies that do a number of things. We're going to destroy what we call historical consciousness and the possibility for moral witnessing. We're going to engage in a politics of disposability, a hallmark of fascism, which calls for racial purity, ultranationalism, the endless militarization of everyday life, as we just saw, of course, with another killing of an absolutely innocent black man. And of course, the suppression of education and dissent, and the demonization of enemies, of people who are considered oppositional. You know, these are not just people who disagree with you. These are people who need to be destroyed. You know, and so I mean that language is one that, in a very fundamental way, speaks to the possibilities of a society that has lost its mind, that now exists in a realm of what I call political and moral nihilism. A society that has lost all vestiges of the social and social responsibility, hates the social contract, and basically believes that the only way to deal with social problems is to basically militarize them and to punish people who are basically engaged in them. So, I mean, they're just some of the many, things that I think that we can, you know, we've been seeing. And, you know, I'm particularly concerned about what's happening in Florida because this guy is a model for fascism. I mean,
by this guy, you mean Florida Governor, Republican Governor Ron DeSantis?
I'm talking about Ron DeSantis.
Yes.
He's unapologetic in his. You know, Primo Levi, the great historian of the Holocaust, made a comment once, and he said that basically every age has its own fascism. The Republican Party since the 1980s has proven that. And now it's coming home to roost, in the words of Malcolm X. We're really starting to see a fascist politics, unapologetic in terms of its attributes, in terms of its principles, in terms of its hatred of anything other than what appears to be white Christian nationalists, and its attempt to destroy every civic institution that basically opposed the possibility for being critical and for creating informed, engaged citizens. That's the key.
We're just getting started. It didn't take long to get him wound up. He came out the blocks, and as I knew he would, and I'm looking forward to the rest of this hour. Let me tell you right now, it's going to be fire for the next, 50 minutes? 50 minutes. I see already a few places I want to go. We'll go there in just a moment. I want to probe this notion of political and moral nihilism, get him to unpack that a great deal more. I want to probe this notion of democracy. He says there are people who believe that democracy doesn't work. I'm not sure it does. I want to challenge him respectfully on that. You know my point of view on this, that America is not yet a democracy. We are at best an experiment in democracy. We've got a Madisonian framework that we can do something with, but we're not as yet a democracy. We're an experiment in democracy, so I'm not sure that I see the evidence that democracy works, although I don't think that's an excuse to behave in fascist ways. We'll talk about that. We'll talk more about this language of brutality he's already started to unpack, and a great deal more. Our guest in this hour is one of my favorite guests, Dr. Henry Giroux. More with him when we come forward on KBLA Talk 1580.
We've got a lot to talk about. Good thing we've got 3 hours. More of Tavis Smiley when we come forward. KBLA Talk 1580. We've got a lot to talk about.
Hi, Maisha Cairo here, KBLA, live at Chase Bank on Crenshaw and Vernon for the In This Together tour with female business owners, a day of empowerment, community panels, and best of all, tips on building business from marketing to capital. I was able to speak with one of the panelists, the owner of Kids Love. Take a listen.
So Kids Love, KIDSLUV, is a first-to-market zero-sugar, vitamin-enhanced functional beverage for kids.
So the zero sugar is really important because if not, the sugar gets on the teeth, it can cause cavities. So as a mom, I love this vitamins and hydration in one. Tell us what's happening here with Chase Bank today.
So I would say, I think what Chase is trying to do is create a community, actually, for entrepreneurs, a place where people can go. They have the space to do it. It's a beautiful space. business and to be able to have these conversations. There are so many benefits to being a women-owned and certified business, from a standpoint of getting into stores, not paying the slotting fees of what it takes to be in stores. So I think Chase is trying to bring awareness to a lot of the things that people just don't know about, that not only the bank can help, but outside of the bank, their relationships can help create.
That's beautiful. And I know, this is how we build equity in communities of color, is kind of spreading that information and that knowledge. So thank you for being here today and doing your part and letting these women know that it is possible.
For KBLA 1580, I'm Maisha Cairo in the community with Chase.
Every pro is an MVP to us. As a Lowe's MVP's Rewards member, you can earn bonus points when you shop select products and brands. Then redeem them for exciting rewards like tools, sports memorabilia, e-gift cards, and more. Join today to become a member and start earning. Bonus points calculated before taxes and fees after applicable discounts, if any. Subject to program terms. While supplies last. Points expire at end of calendar year. Visit Lowe's.com/MVP's bonus points for details.
Periods don't care what you're doing, but your pad should. Get Always Triple Protection System in Always Day and Night Pads. Always Day Pads protect when active by wicking away gushes 2 times faster than leading store brands and giving us up to 100% leak-free and odor-free comfort. When we size up our pad at night, we get the same triple protection, plus up to 75% more coverage in the back for when we're laying down. No matter what, Always has you covered, day and night.
Conversations that matter. You're listening to Tavis Smiley on KBLA Talk 1580.
Dr. Henry Giroux, let's start with this notion of political and moral nihilism that you referenced earlier. Give me more on that first, and we'll move from there, sir.
Yeah, I talk about moral nihilism in a sense that I'm talking about a political and economic system that increasingly has arrived at the point where the question of social responsibility has been eliminated from almost any consideration. You have a capitalist system that says that basically economic activity shouldn't be concerned with questions of social cost. And I think that when that happens, what begins to happen throughout every aspect of the social structure is that questions of social responsibility disappear. And I think that when questions of social responsibility disappear, power is no longer accountable. Civic culture gets eradicated. There's a systematic erosion of any sense of shared citizenship. Private interests become much more important than collective interests. Social needs begin to disappear because they're not factored into a society that takes seriously the fact that we're connected, and that we're connected by issues of compassion, justice, love, sensitivity, the rights of others. And when that language disappears, and the language of self-interest, and the language of political corruption, and the language of violence, and the language of what I would call an amazing investment in political power at any cost, you really begin to have the death. You begin to live in what I call a civic death zone, because it's willing to basically justify and even argue for, if not be, how might you say it, proud of the fact that you can eliminate people from Medicaid. For instance, 2.7 million people in Florida who have no health insurance, as one example, or eliminate young children from a tax credit, which means that 3.7 million children will go into poverty. Can you believe this? And these are policies that now are justified in the name of expediency for lowering the cost of taxes for the rich. That's about the death of ethics.
I love that, death of ethics, the death of ethics. You mentioned corruption. What happens to a democracy, and I want to probe this notion of whether democracy does it. Well, let me start with that. I don't want to get ahead of myself. So
I know. I'm really curious about that point you made, because I really want to engage it.
Let's engage that, because my view is that America has a Madisonian framework for democracy. But the ways in which we are acting suggest to me that we are not as yet a democracy. At best, we are an experiment in democracy. But there's a fundamental difference to my mind between the ideals, the IDEALS that we profess, and the crazy, insane ideas that you were just unpacking, including fascism, that we seem to embrace. So at best, I think we are an experiment in democracy. We're not quite a democracy yet. And to that end, I can see then how people will exploit the notion that democracy really doesn't work, and they then suggest other things, including authoritarianism. That's my take. Give me yours.
Well, my argument has always been that the United States is not a democracy. I mean, there's a difference between the ideal and the reality of what a democracy represents. And I think that any society built on enormous racial inequities and class differences and basically engages in an ongoing war culture against the social state is far from a democracy. But I think that the real issue here is, and it's fundamental, because it's about questions of voice and about questions of power. In a democracy, we have an alleged democracy in which you have political rights and you have personal rights, but you don't have economic rights. You can't have a democracy without economic rights. I'm sorry. And that's one of the reasons why I'm a socialist. I mean, I believe in democratic socialism. I think that capitalism and democracy are not the same thing. It's a huge mistake we have made. But I think that what we hear now coming from the right is not only an attack on the ideal of democracy, but it's a language that basically supports the notion of authoritarianism, which is very different. They're not saying that democracy. They're not engaging in what you and I might call the failures of conflating capitalism and democracy. What they're saying is the very ideals of democracy we don't buy into. They're too dangerous. And that's why they use the phrase illiberal democracy as a way to justify a political system that they now align themselves with and are arguing for.
So to your notion that you can't have a democracy without political rights, personal rights, and economic rights. I get the political, I get the personal, and more importantly, I get how you can set a frame for those. But when it comes to economic rights, how would you guarantee every fellow citizen an economic right? Help me imagine that. What does that look like?
Let me tell you what I think it looks like in terms of a very simple concept, the notion of time. When time is a deprivation, you have to make a choice between food and drugs. When time is a deprivation because social provisions don't exist that guarantee the most basic economic rights, health care, free education, housing, things that basically impinge on your agency in such a way that you cannot even imagine, never mind live out the ideals of democracy. And I think that when we fail to recognize that, we fail to recognize that people who are engaged in a day-to-day war for survival, democracy is meaningless. It's just meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. And in many cases, you get people, they don't have time to think about whether they should vote. They don't have time to think about, what the major issues are that Republicans and these far-right fascist groups are pushing and how they impinge on their lives. They don't live in the world of abstractions. They live in the world of visceral violence. And it seems to me that until we come to grips with this, and try to understand that you need a social welfare state in which the basic elements that provide a sense of political individual agency are at work, you don't have a democracy. And that's what they fear. But there's also another fear, Tavis. And that other fear is they define democracy in the very distorted terms in which they use that term as basically a place of citizenship for white people. The public sphere is not a public sphere. It's a sphere for white Christian nationalists. It's not a sphere for people, what we call a vast majority of different groups who can occupy the public sphere and the social state in ways that suggest an alignment of differences in the interest of the common good. That stuff disappears in that discourse.
What happens to a democracy, whether we are one presently or not? That's what we aim to be, or aim to become. What happens in a democracy when there's this level of extreme greed and normalized corruption?
What happens is it turns into a fascist politics. What happens is that we move away from democracy to extremism. We move away from trying to understand what the historical, structural, economic causes of inequality and the war against democracy are, and we look for scapegoats. And we find them of course, we find them in blacks. We find them in indigenous people. We find them in people who are considered disposable. We find them in those people basically who are the objects of racial cleansing. We find them in those groups that are being erased from history, those groups for whom it becomes dangerous to become literate.
I want to go to Florida because I was just trying to figure out the order I want to do this. I got two thoughts in my head at the same time. Let me go to Florida because you teed that up earlier, and the Republican governor, Ron DeSantis there, who is completely out of control on so many levels. We don't have time to really unpack all of that. But I was literally just reading yesterday a couple of things I want to bring to the attention of the audience. I know Dr. Henry Giroux already knows this, but I want to bring it to your attention. So you've been hearing on this program and other places that in Florida, Ron DeSantis has pushed back. We had a conversation here days ago about this African-American AP course from the College Board that he refuses to be taught, allowed to be taught in the state of Florida. So he won't let them teach this AP course. I mean, literally an advanced placement course, an AP course in African-American studies. He will not allow that to be taught in Florida. He's pushed back against that and made it illegal. And in other ways and spaces with his Stop Woke Act, that's what it's called, the Stop Woke Act, he is coming down hard on teaching the truth in classrooms in a variety of ways. Here's what I was reading, though, literally just yesterday, that there are now school districts in the state of Florida. Hear me on this. There are now school districts in the state of Florida who are telling teachers to hide certain books. They're literally telling them to hide books. They're telling them because we don't know what's legal and what's illegal, because we don't know what might get you arrested, might get you fired. They're literally telling teachers to hide certain books, to not teach certain subject matter, to not reference certain books, certain text in their syllabus or syllabi. But that's what's happening in the state of Florida, that teachers are being told by their administrators to hide certain books in the state of Florida lest they end up being arrested or sent to jail. I ask very simply, Dr. Giroux, what does that remind you of?
Well, I mean, we've seen this before, right? I mean, we've seen the banning of books. We've seen the call for loyalty lists. We've seen the firing of people who don't agree with state-aligned propaganda. I mean, this is not new. But I think that what often happens in this discourse about what's going on in Florida and, of course, in Texas and a whole range of other states. There are 15 states, I think, right now that have laws in place or are attempting to put in place that are engaged in eliminating the critical function of education entirely. But I think what we're seeing here is we're really seeing an attack on public education. Mm-hmm. And the problem is it's public. They really want to privatize education. They really do. I mean, they have no interest in allowing public education to function in a way that it can assume its critical function. I mean, I think you have to remember, right, the first casualty of authoritarianism are the minds that would oppose it. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that what we're seeing here is we're in the censorship, in the denial of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, and the internment, the Japanese internment, and the elimination of indigenous people. We're seeing the elimination of a history that would give people the right to understand, or the willingness to understand, and the need to understand how history might repeat itself and what you might want to do in light of the way in which it's manifesting itself and in terms of what has happened in the past. So history becomes dangerous. This is an attack on public education, an attempt to privatize it. It's an attack on what I call basically political agency, the ability of people to be informed so they can be actively engaged citizens. And it's an attack in many ways on the very viability of what a democracy needs. And what it needs are people who are analytical, who are critical, who are smart. This is really a program for not just manufactured ignorance. It's a program that elevates instinct over emotion and indoctrination over the possibility of an informed public. It's very dangerous. Yeah. And I think you need to put these pieces together to understand that in the long run, this is an attack on the very basis of what any democracy, whether an ideal or not, would stand for. And that is, you've got to have citizens who are informed. You've got to have citizens who have an historical consciousness. You've got to have citizens in a way who can exercise a sense of political and moral agency. You know, you can't turn these places into pedagogical death zones, which is what, I mean, you're dealing with pedagogical death zones. These are places of terminal exclusion. They're factories for terminal exclusion. They write people out of the language of citizenship. They write people out of the language of justice. And they write people out of the language of retribution. And that's dangerous.
Speaking of dangerous, you and I agree on this, that when authoritarianism starts creeping, when fascism hits the fast-forward button, the first casualty is always truth. Truth is always the first casualty, so you and I agree in that regard. Let me do something now that I advise all of my friends and young students not to do. I tell folk all the time, particularly if you're black, or for that matter, any race, there are two things you want to stay away from, and Dave Chappelle made a joke about this recently on not long ago on Saturday Night Live. When he said, keep the Jews out of your mouth. You do not want to be making comments about the Jewish community. And number two, I tell folks, stay away from Hitler. Just don't make references to Hitler. Because if you don't get your frame right, you'll lose your job. I raise that because while I encourage people to be careful about how they invoke the name of Hitler in their political commentary, this thing about Ron DeSantis in Florida is not just eerie, it's scary. And I think it's a cautionary tale, because when you talk about historically places around the globe that we talk about today and offer today as examples of what we do not want to be, given our effort to become more human, what happened in these communities, in these societies rather, was that they started banning books. They started telling people to hide certain material. This is the making of anarchy. This is the making of fascism. This is the making of dictatorship. It's the making of et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm raising that only because I want to make this point, Professor Giroux, and that is that we cannot, to my mind, just dismiss Ron DeSantis as another Republican, another crazy guy. My sense is that we get caught up in the politics of talking about Ron DeSantis, but I don't think we're really looking at what he is doing and what this means historically for society who started out doing stuff like this.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and I think we can take that lesson right from DeSantis. I mean, the last thing that DeSantis wants people to do is to understand the history of fascism, to understand the history of racial capitalism, and how fascism basically begins in the U.S., maybe with the Ku Klux Klan, and not simply in the 1930s with Hitler. I mean, Hitler was a guy who turned to the United States to try to understand something about eugenicism. Mm-hmm. But I think that what's really crucial here is that we have a language in the United States that tends to individualize problems, right? There's no bridge between looking at very particular issues and connecting them to larger systemic considerations, whether historical or relational. And I think when you fall into that trap, it's easy to write off somebody like DeSantis, as people did with Trump. They might say, "Oh, he's crazy," "Oh, he's just a clown," or "He's a buffoon." Individualizing the problem, you have no way to engage the social in terms of its larger politics. You know this argument. It's the argument of rogue cops, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, they're rogue cops. It doesn't really speak to the culture of violence that's basically imprinted in police forces. Well, they're not rogue cops. I mean, they're part of a system, and if you don't understand the system in terms of its structural and ideological manifestations, you lose it. No. You have no way of translating particular issues into larger social problems.
You're making a powerful point, and to that end, if you missed our conversation yesterday with Connie Rice at the start of hour 2 yesterday, we were honored to receive a phone call from our friend and brother Ben Crump, who was about to walk into the church in Memphis for the funeral of Tyree Nichols. Ben Crump called into this program yesterday live and exclusively to share his thoughts with us before he went into the funeral service for Tyree Nichols. After Ben Crump got off the phone, we spent the rest of that hour with Connie Rice. And given what Henry Giroux just says now about the history of policing and the state of policing, if you missed our conversation yesterday with Connie Rice, you missed something. Go to the podcast, go to our platforms. You must hear the way Connie Rice put it down yesterday on this program. We'll continue with Henry Giroux when we come forward after news, traffic, and sports on KBLA Talk 1580.
The station you turn to when you've had it up to gear with cultural incompetence. KBLA Talk 1580.
I'm Esther Dillard, and here's the latest from the Black Information Network. High school students can now take AP African American Studies. This comes after the original was blocked by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, along with the Florida Department of Education. They claimed it was contrary to state law because some parts of the course they believed included the indoctrination of students with critical race theory and the queer experience. The College Board stripped those parts out, and now the course is back on the table as a revised version. A group of House Democrats is raising concerns over U.S. Capitol security ahead of President Biden's State of the Union address. More than a dozen Democrats signed a letter to congressional leaders condemning the Republican majority's decision to roll back security measures put in place after the Capitol riot. That includes removing metal detectors outside the House and Senate chambers. And that's the latest. I'm Esther Dillard from the Black Information Network and BINnews.com.
Troubles on the 105 westbound in Linwood with a stalled big rig in the middle lane just past Long Beach Boulevard. Traffic's heavy from the 710. A stall in downtown LA on the 110 northbound at 5th, 6th Street. A minor tie-up in Griffith Park, 134 eastbound at Forest Lawn Drive. And working on a wreck on the 110 southbound at Academy Road, slowing from Figueroa.
Jackson Hewitt gets you your biggest tax refund guaranteed, plus a chance to double your refund or win weekly prizes with their Double Your Refund sweepstakes. File your taxes on the double. No purchase necessary. U.S. residents 18 or older who file a 2022 federal tax return. Ends 4/2/22.
This is the KBLA Sports Minute with Ray Richardson.
Both of LA's NBA teams are back in action tonight in the Midwest. The Clippers are at Milwaukee. The Lakers are at Indiana. LeBron enters tonight's game 89 points shy of passing Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. As LeBron gets closer to the record, ticket prices for the Lakers' next two home games are rising. The lowest ticket price for the February 7th game against Oklahoma City is $326, a 390% increase. For the February 9th game against Milwaukee, the lowest ticket is $357. Top 5 men's college basketball teams in this week's AP poll: Purdue, Tennessee, Houston, Alabama, and Arizona. Top 5 women's teams: South Carolina, Stanford, LSU, Indiana, and UConn. No debates, no speculation, just the info you need. That's your KBLA Sports Minute. I'm Ray Richardson. Stay with us for more news, opinions, and conversation on KBLA Talk 1580. We've got a lot to talk about.
Get ready for an intimate evening with Life Jennings. Valentine's Night, February 14th at the Redondo Beach Performing Arts Center. Doors open at 7 p.m., showtime 8. Advance tickets start at $65. Life Jennings and special guests. Valentine's Night at the Redondo Beach Performing Arts Center. For tickets, call 800-595-4849. For more info, call 323-849-9577 or visit jimsbenefitconcert.org.
Our Weekly Los Angeles is the largest audited black newspaper in the state of California with a distribution of over 50,000 copies weekly. Pick up a copy every Thursday to get the latest news on African American communities of LA. You can also keep up with what's going on in Los Angeles and surrounding cities by going to www.ourweekly.com. The Our Weekly website is updated daily with the current news about us and for us. For your advertising needs, Our Weekly offers economical advertising packages to fit your budget. Feel free to call Our Weekly Los Angeles at 323-905-1300 or visit the website at www.ourweekly.com. Our Weekly Los Angeles, reporting news that matters to you.
Here at McKay's Family Mortuary, we offer a full line of services with a fine selection of caskets and urns. Also, assistance with cemeteries along with luxury limousine and funeral coaches and other needs pertaining to your family's wishes for your loved one. We accept Veterans Victim Witness Program for mortuary services only at zero cost to you. Cemetery selection does not apply. All insurances are accepted. McKay's Funeral Home understands that saying goodbye is never easy. That's why we've been providing compassionate and professional funeral services to the community for over a decade. Please contact McKay's Family Mortuary, serving Los Angeles, San Bernardino, and Riverside counties and the High Desert. 3918 Marine Avenue, Lawndale, California. 310-978-8877. That's 310-978-8877. By appointment only or log on to mckaysmortuaries.com.
Broadcasting live from the York Park, USA. Welcome back to your home for unapologetically progressive radio. KBLA Talk 1580.
Dr. Henry Giroux, what would it take for this tinderbox of fascism in Florida to be lit into a full-bore fire?
Well, well, Dave, Well, I think clearly the people of Florida and people in the United States have to wake up and recognize that the first thing that one of the rules of authoritarianism is that power becomes invisible in terms of how it's used and what its consequences are. And I think to the degree that it becomes visible, it can be in some way understood in order to be resisted, in order to be overtaken. And I think that to go back to the way this conversation has been developing, what people like DeSantis and others, he's just a symbol, really, and along with Trump and others, are really relying on, is they recognize the power of learned helplessness. They recognize something that Baldwin once said. He said, ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. And I think that, ignorance is learned. It's a habit. And it's learned when civic institutions begin to collapse. And I think people need to raise fundamental questions about what kind of future do they want to live in. Do they want to live in a future basically in which matters of racism, the politics of disposability, war, fear, anti-intellectualism, and white supremacy govern their lives? Or, in fact, are they going to have to translate basically an understanding of what's going on into a kind of collective action, a unity of sorts of various groups, from workers to various people fighting for all kinds of rights, whether it be women's reproductive rights or the rights to save the planet? They're going to have to come together in a mass party in order to challenge this behemoth.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, with all due respect to my fellow citizens in this place called America, with all due respect to fellow citizens, I wonder how much of this, if any of this, being allowed to take hold, fascism that is, in our nation, has to do with a dumbed-down demos.
Oh, you got it. I mean, you hit it, Tavis. I'll tell you. I mean, look, I wrote a book about what I call manufactured ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
And central to that book is the notion that education is really central to politics. And it doesn't just take place in schools. It takes place in a whole range of cultural apparatuses that are largely controlled by the Murdochs of the world, the corporate elite. Fortunately, we have outliers like your program and others. But it seems to me that what you have is you have a culture that is basically aligned with stupidity and ignorance in the interest of keeping people dumb, so that they don't basically have to hold power accountable. I mean, when Trump said he loves the uneducated, that wasn't a joke. And when DeSantis passes laws that bans books, makes librarians tremble in fear for being persecuted because they have certain books in the library, or teachers have certain books in the room. When you say you can't talk about race, you can't talk about transgender. I mean, this is basically an attempt to depoliticize people by taking away their ability to understand both their relationship to themselves, others, and the larger world, from being able to recognize evil. Your argument about the truth, when the truth collapses into misinformation, what emerges is the inability to understand and recognize evil. That's what we don't get here. I mean, historical consciousness and literacy and liberation inform each other. The freedom to learn, the freedom to understand, the freedom to engage is the freedom to bear witness in the face of racist terror. And that's a freedom that we have to once again come to grips with.
Let's interrogate here now, Henry Giroux, this notion of truth. And I guess the question is, what happens, again, to a democracy when the truth becomes what each of us determines it to be?
Well, I think it mimics a kind of neoliberalism, which seems to suggest that the only thing that matters is self-interest and the world in which the world that we occupy for our own interest, and that we don't need evidence, we don't need justice, we don't need compassion, we don't need an historical reckoning, we don't need critical analysis, we don't need an informed position. It's a world in which you can't distinguish between opinions and real analytical, evidence-based kinds of arguments. That's an attack on reason. That's not just an attack on the truth. That's the celebration of a form of irrationality that says there is no truth, that anything that anybody says has to be true because there's no world outside of who they are and what they believe in. That's basically more than a conspiracy theory. That's the ultimate basis for stupidity and ignorance.
Since you mentioned reason, what's your view on how we regard or disregard the notion of reason today in our public discourse?
I think reason has been weaponized. I think that the ability to have an informed judgment, the ability to take scientific evidence into consideration, the ability to read history critically and to in some way reveal its dynamics, whether they're in the interest of liberation or the interest of injustice. I mean, these things are very frightening because critical understanding, critical consciousness, the ability to think critically opens up doors that people often don't want to walk through. They don't want to go into that room where you have to be somewhat accountable for the past by at least asking yourself, what can I do when the worst dimensions of that past reproduces itself? But reason has another marker, it seems to me. Reason can be dangerous in that it can make visible what is often invisible. It can expose those kinds of contradictions that people in power don't want to see exposed because, for a very fundamental reason, they don't want to be held accountable for reproducing them.
You mentioned critical thinking a moment ago. I want to come to that right quick here because it seems to me, as we're talking about education and the fascist ways in Florida, that Ron DeSantis is pushing back against that. It seems to me that if there is one goal, if education only has one goal, that one goal ought to be to teach us how to think critically for ourselves. That is the ultimate goal, it seems to me, of any educational pursuit. That you learn.
No, I don't believe that.
Okay. Let me finish my thesis. I love this. I love when guests disagree with me. That's why I said it seems to me, and I'll shut up and let you respond. It seems to me that if there is but only one goal, that goal to me ought to be that education teaches us how to think critically for ourselves. You disagree? Tell me what your take is, and tell me why.
I'll tell you why.
Okay,
Tavis.
tell me.
Okay. I'm going to make a distinction for you that my friend Paulo Freire used to make.
Okay.
I think there's a difference between critical thinking and critical consciousness. And I think critical thinking says, yeah, you've got to be analytical, you have to be able to understand issues, you have to be able to take things apart, you have to be informed. But critical consciousness says you have to be a critical thinker in order to be able to intervene in the world and make a difference when it's necessary.
Nope, I lose. Okay. that was simple, and that was quick, and that was easy. I lose. I have to change my phrase. I want to marinate on that some more, but I hear your point loud and clear. More importantly, I felt the point you made about the distinction between critical thinking and critical consciousness. Here's my question right quick. Assuming that you were right about this, and assuming that perhaps I'm wrong, I'll marinate on it more. But whether it's that's why I say all the time. Let me just stop for a second. I say all the time on this program. I said a few moments ago that at our best, what we do is to offer you an opportunity to re-examine the assumptions that you hold. That's true for me as a talk show host. Re-examining the assumptions that I hold, expanding my inventory of ideas. If it's good enough for me, it ought to be good enough for you. But that's what this program does at its best. And there are days I walk in here and my assumptions get re-examined. I hear the point he's making about critical thinking versus critical consciousness. By either one of those standards, how do you think we're doing in our education system as we now know it?
Oh, I think the education system is under enormous siege. I mean, you know, and it didn't just begin, of course, with Trump and with DeSantis. I mean, you know, the educational system since the 1980s and with the emergence of Ronald Reagan started implementing policies in which critical education and critical consciousness and teaching kids to be informed citizens began to disappear. I mean, it was an education for teaching for the test. It was an education that seemed to suggest that you only get an education in order to get a good job, an education to be a worker, to be able to work in McDonald's and not complain. I mean, it wasn't an education that basically said the first purpose of education is to create one that gives students the opportunity to both engage, deepen, and understand the role they play in making a democracy work, and the role they play in being compassionate and just human beings. You don't get educated to simply improve your own self-interest. You get educated in order to live in a better world. You get educated in order to think not just simply to question your own assumptions, but you get educated in order to be more compassionate and what it means to think outside of your own interest, so that you can live in a world in which the question of compassion and justice and care and love matter. They become material elements of what it means to be a fully developed human being. It means you get educated to expand your humanity. That's what it should mean.
As my friend Zoe Williams would say, if he were here right now, Henry Giroux is on fire right now on KBLA Talk 1580. Check out Zoe Williams every night, 7 to 9 p.m. You will not regret that. When we come forward with Henry Giroux, who is on fire right about now, we'll talk about this notion he raised earlier that I haven't had a chance to interrogate yet. The death of ethics, as he put it, the death of ethics. We'll talk about that. And I want to pivot ever so gently to this notion of housing. We raised the issue of housing earlier, but should housing be a right in this country? You're listening to Henry Giroux on KBLA Talk 1580.
Be sure to like and follow Tavis Smiley at The Real Tavis Smiley and get Twitter updates at Tavis Smiley. The conversation continues when we come forward.
Maisha Cairo here with your K-Black Minute News, brought to you by CaliforniaBlackMedia.org. Due to recent weather challenges in California, at least 20 people lost their lives in the latest storms. And so, early January, Governor Newsom requested an expedited major disaster declaration for California, which was approved by President Biden for select counties. This making declaration that damage is beyond the combined capabilities of local and state governments to respond, so affected areas will be eligible for federal assistance programs. If you are personally affected, you can apply for state disaster assistance on cdss.ca.gov. For federal help through FEMA, visit disasterassistance.gov. To learn more about help, local resources, or for free emergency alert, visit calalerts.org. Look into comprehensive auto insurance for automobile damage due to severe weather. Home and renters insurance should cover damage from fallen trees and wind. For KBLA, I'm Maisha Cairo, and that's your K-Black Minute News.
Hi, it's Lynn Richardson with the Millionaires Roundtable. Have you heard about Lendistry? Come on now. Lendistry is a national Black-led small business lender that is headquartered right here in LA. Once you've started your business, Lendistry provides flexible financing options starting at $50,000 to help you access the affordable capital needed to grow. Whether financing is needed to increase working capital, acquire a business, purchase inventory and equipment, or refinance debt, Lendistry has a solution for you. Lending products range from traditional business term loans and lines of credit to SBA 7A loans and commercial real estate financing. Lendistry's pre-application process is simple and does not impact your credit score. Visit lendistry.com/KBLA. That's LENDISTRY.com/KBLA to learn more and get started with an application right on the website.
That was another way. I would smoke once an hour. That didn't work either. All that would happen at some point of the day, I would end up doubling up. Other ways that I tried to quit was I stopped buying cigarettes totally. But if I took 3 puffs off of 15 friends, those didn't count because they weren't my cigarettes and they weren't full cigarettes. I went through a lot.
Every attempt is part of your story to quit for good. Visit Kick It California today at kickitca.org.
Some people won't give you the real talk on drugs, but it's time we know the facts. Fentanyl is killing people. It's a powerful opioid, often made illegally and commonly mixed with illicit drugs. It can even be pressed into counterfeit pills that resemble prescription medications. Just 2 milligrams, about the size of a few grains of sand, could potentially be lethal. This isn't an ad to scare you, but it is an ad to make you think twice. Get the facts. Go to realdealonfentanyl.com. This message is brought to you by the Ad Council.
This is KBLA Talk 1580, where hate meets a scholarly match.
Henry Giroux, when you said earlier, when you invoked this phrase earlier, the death of ethics, you meant by that what exactly?
I meant that the question of social responsibility and care for the others is substituted for a system that basically seems to suggest a reality TV program that everybody's on the island, we're all on the island, but only one people really wins in the end. I mean, there's this kind of social Darwinism that pits people against each other by celebrating a kind of solipsistic self-interest in what I would call an unchecked individualism that seems to suggest that that a kind of militaristic competition and a kind of hyper-masculinity are really what should define our relationship to each other. Shared fears, shared anxiety, the cost of winning. I mean, all that kind of ethic is basically a war on the social. It's a war on social responsibility, and it ends up sort of offering the notion that any attempt to basically be kind or to be compassionate or to be just is basically a weakness. That it doesn't measure up to what it means to be a real man in what I call a warrior culture. The warrior culture is not just about the police. The warrior culture is about the entire society. We live in a society in which the punishing state has replaced the social state. All problems are individualized. Poverty is because you want to be poor and you're stupid. You're homeless because you like living outside. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's an ethic that destroys questions of character, destroys questions of ethics and social responsibility, and it's very dangerous. And it provides the precondition for fascism.
When you say unchecked individualism, I'm trying to unpack that in my own thinking. This notion of unchecked individualism, and I'm wrestling with it because it seems to me that rugged individualism, as it has been advanced and defined, is part of the American ethos itself.
It is part of the American ethos, and it's a very dangerous part of the American ethos. And it's intensified under a kind of what I call savage capitalism that seems to suggest that the only interest that matters is self-interest. Well, the only interest that matters when you live in a society and you claim the only interest that matters is self-interest, you're on a very dangerous road to social decay. Because basically we're interconnected, and we have to live with each other, and we have to be able to think about more than our own self-interest in order to survive in a society in which these interrelationships and these modes of solidarity are absolutely crucial. So it seems to me that where this unchecked individualism goes is into a kind of privatized nihilism that basically has no room whatsoever for questions of justice, for questions of solidarity, for questions of shared values. And again, I think it's dangerous, and I think it removes the question of justice and compassion and equity, which is why they're reveled so much by the DeSantises and the Trumps of the world. Remember, these are people who believe that equality and equity is an injustice. And think about what that means in terms of how that easily translates into a denial of social responsibility. Orban in Hungary, who is, the right wing's ultimate sort of hero. Mm-hmm. Here's a guy who says he's against mixed racing. Think about that in terms of social responsibility. Yeah. Think about what this racial cleansing that we see taking place in schools today. How does that measure with the death of social responsibility? What it seems to suggest is it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah. In our remaining moments with Henry Giroux, I want to come to this notion of housing. We are wrestling with the issue of homelessness here in Los Angeles. Our new mayor, Karen Bass, has made this her top priority, and there are all kinds of questions being raised about how she's going to accomplish what she said she would do when she ran. And we're not the only city wrestling with this issue of homelessness and the unhoused. But it seems to me in this debate, Henry Giroux, about the decay, how might I put it, the decay of our civilization and the devolution of our culture, at the center of that debate has to be a conversation about housing. And I want to close by asking whether or not in that regard housing in this country should be a right. Our remaining moments with Henry Giroux when we come forward on KBLA Talk 1580.
We may be LA's newest talk station, but when you're punching above your weight, it's not about whether you can throw a punch. Can you take a punch? We're unapologetically progressive. KBLA Talk 1580. And we don't black down. KBLA Talk 1580. We've got a lot to talk about.
KBLA Talk 1580 joins you in standing for education as a right, not a privilege. Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science is a private, non-profit, community-founded, student-centered university committed to cultivating diverse health profession leaders who are dedicated to social justice and health equity for underserved populations. CDU does this through outstanding education, clinical service, and community engagement. Recently, Charles Drew University made history by opening only the 5th medical school at an historically black university. Congratulations, South LA, and congratulations to the dean of the medical school, Dr. Deborah Protho-Stiff. CDU is now training doctors and providing $90 million in annual economic benefit to Watts and surrounding neighborhoods. To apply for medical school, get more information, or sign your child up for the Junior Doctors Saturday School program, visit cdrewu.edu. That's cdrewu.edu. At KBLA, we are dedicated to equity in education and ending healthcare apartheid, and we don't black down. This is a community call to action from KBLA Talk 1580.
Here at McKay's Family Mortuary, we offer a full line of services with a fine selection of caskets and urns. Also, assistance with cemeteries along with luxury limousine and funeral coaches and other needs pertaining to your family's wishes for your loved one. We accept Veterans Victim Witness Program for mortuary services only at zero cost to you. Cemetery selection does not apply. All insurances are accepted. McKay's Funeral Home understands that saying goodbye is never easy. That's why we've been providing compassionate and professional funeral services to the community for over a decade. Please contact McKay's Family Mortuary, serving Los Angeles, San Bernardino, and Riverside counties and the High Desert. 3918 Marine Avenue, Lawndale, California. 310-978-8877. That's 310-978-8877. By appointment only or log on to mckaysmortuaries.com.
Interrogating your assumptions and expanding your inventory of ideas. Let's get back to Tavis Smiley on KBLA Talk 1580.
Let's get back to Henry Giroux on KBLA Talk 1580. I got 3 minutes left in this conversation with him, which I have immensely enjoyed and been challenged by, as I hope you have been as well. The extra question, I think, Dr. Giroux, is whether or not housing should be a right.
Absolutely, it should be a right. But the real question is not whether housing should be a right. The real question is why it isn't. And it seems to me it isn't because we refuse to link housing to the scourge of inequality in the United States. And the misappropriation of funds that should be should be used in the interest of the public good rather than the interest of basically corporations, the military, and private interests. So if we're going to talk about housing, we have to talk about inequality. I mean, the United States is one of the most inequitous countries in the world. It has one of the worst health care systems in the world. It's a system that basically refuses to provide the social provisions that would give people a decent life and affirm their dignity. And one consequence of that are two things. One is we have a massive degree of homelessness. And secondly, we don't have the language to really address it, except to say we should build more houses. Or we should, appropriate those buildings that lay vacant where people could basically live. I think in the short run, some of those responses are okay. But in the long run, there's a fundamental problem, and that fundamental problem is 1% of the population owns about 50% of all the wealth. And corporations are not taxed, and we don't have a language for the public good. When we get a language for the public good that's linked to the redistribution of wealth and power in the United States, the housing problem will be solved.
I lied. That was not my exit question. Here's my exit question with it. 90 seconds to go. As I'm listening to you talk about why housing should be a right and why it isn't, frankly, there are those who are listening right now, perhaps who believe, as many other Americans do, that too many handouts, certainly those on the right believe, that too many handouts make folk lazy. And the most recent example of that is these PPP checks. You give people money and you end up with a great resignation. How do you respond to folk who say that too many rights, too many handouts make American citizens lazy?
I think they misread the issue. I think if you really want to talk about handouts to the rich. They're completely unjust. Whether you're talking about handouts to corporations or to people like Trump who make millions of dollars and don't pay taxes, that's where the handouts, it seems to me, represent an injustice. But to provide literally meager support to people who are struggling to stay alive, the claim that somehow makes people lazy is worse than a lie. It's a discourse of ignorance that basically traps people in their own greed and lack of compassion.
I promised you an hour ago you'd be empowered by this hour. Did I lie? I think not. Henry Giroux, good to have you on. We'll do it again. All the best to you, my friend.
Okay, thanks, Tavis.
More of KBLA Talk 1580 when we come forward.
KBLA 1580 Santa Monica.
I'm Esther Dillard, and here's the latest from the Black Information Network.